Let me just take a second to welcome everyone here for our talk today. It's going to be a discussion with Dr. Nicol Turner-Lee on public safety and the politics of surveillance. I always struggle with the headlines and titles that I want to present, put on talks and papers that I write, but I think this one fits our topic perfectly today. And Dr. Turner-Lee is an expert on matters involving technology and how they relate to society and civil liberties and all of the things that we associate with society in general. And so I just want to thank you, Dr. Turner-Lee, for joining us today.
Thank you, Les, and thank you for allowing me to be a part of the public leadership program, so PLA program.
So I'm Dr. Lester Andrist. I am the program director of the Public Safety Leadership and Administration Professional Master's Program here at the University of Maryland. We are a new professional master's program aimed at public safety professionals who are seeking to advance in their careers. We have been in operation for about a year. And one of the great things about our program, I'll just take 1 second here to make a little pitch, is that we actually have 2 graduate certificates that are associated with this professional master's program. We have 1 graduate certificate in what's called leadership in diverse organizations. And we have another graduate certificate in criminal justice administration. And the idea is that you can actually take each one of these in kind of a piecemeal fashion, if you like. So you can take 1 certificate at a time and then add them together to create the master's degree. Or if you've decided you've gone far enough with 1 or 2 of these graduate certificates, you can just back out at that point and take the certificates with you. But in either case, it's a way to kind of get a jump start or to advance in your career. And we just have, I can't say enough about the program. It's something I'm really happy to be a part of because we've had excellent students, especially from the DC area. Okay, so without further ado, Dr. Turner-Lee is a sociologist and senior fellow of governance studies at the Brookings Institution. She is the director of the Center for Technology Innovation and serves as co-editor-in-chief of TechTank, which is a blog that focuses on new developments in science and technology policy. Most importantly for our purposes, Dr. Turner-Lee is an instructor in our program. We're very lucky to have her. And she is currently teaching 2 of the classes in our program. One is called Public Image Management and Technological Solutions. And then we have another program, another class called Applied Research Methods, both on the sociology side of things in our program. But she's doing a fantastic job. Lots of great comments. By the way, Nicole, you may not know this, but from our students who love you, I get lots of feedback from them. And so, yeah, we're lucky to have you. And thanks again for coming.
I advocate for policy and, don't know how to turn on my mic.
Yeah, so, you're good.
Thank you, Les, for having me. And I'm really excited to be a part of the program. I think it's one of the premier programs that really blends what I think are some practical applications of the public safety professions with the academic rigor of how you actually apply things like, applied research, public image leadership into the role. So for those of you that may be watching this, it's a really great opportunity to join the program for those, particularly at this time where we actually need more sensitivities when it comes to public safety. Yeah. As Mark said, I'm at Brookings and I have a forthcoming book that's on the U.S. digital divide. I stay busy when it comes to just talking about how we advocate for those who are less fortunate to be online. And I also stay busy because I manage our portfolio at Brookings in artificial intelligence, particularly algorithmic bias. And surveillance technologies actually come under that guise when we start to think about, how do we make these systems more democratic, more fair, more ethical, and inclusive. And so I'm excited to talk about that today because I think there's a couple things happening, right, in society We're in the brink of all of these policies that are going to basically help us get out of this pandemic, even though we think we are out of it, but we're really not, because we're now seeing the resurgence of the variant of a variant that is very much, mirroring the coronavirus. But then, two, we also are coming out of a period that I hope that many will not forget, which is a wild storm of issues related to racial equity. And the George Floyd murder was one example where I think, and I talk about this in my classes, where it really amplified the need for the PLA program, in particular, as we sensitize people to the fact that they are operating within a context that has a lot of rigor and a lot of history related to it. So I'm excited about this conversation because I think, part of what we often confuse when we hear the word surveillance is that it's new, and it's not, right?
No.
But it's also contextualized in among certain groups and populations and certain issues. So have at it with questions. But
Yeah.
thank you, Mark, and others for joining. But let's get right into this because I think it's a really important conversation.
Yeah, and I think just as a quick statement off the bat, I think that the thing that makes surveillance such an interesting topic for me, at least, is frankly because it's challenging. Because surveillance isn't new, but I get the sense that the pace at which the changes and capabilities of surveillance has been happening is new, and it takes a lot, I think, to kind of stay on top of what's happening and how it's affecting our lives.
I agree.
Yeah. So my first question for you, Nicole, is in terms of surveillance. Then let's just talk kind of nuts and bolts and get very concrete about this. What are the technologies or the policies that are most dramatically, in your view, changing the lives of average Americans? What should be on our radar?
Yeah, so let me talk about this from sort of three verticals, if you don't mind, just so
Sure.
we sort of unpack this term of surveillance. So, as I said before, surveillance is not a new concept, it's not a new term. We always have had levels of surveillance societal wise, not as much as we see today, which I'll talk about in a moment. But there's always been some level of people watching us, right? George Orwell in 1984 talks about that the
Yeah.
government was watching us. And, that concept of having some type of gatekeeper has pretty much prevailed in society. Historically, surveillance became much more contentious when we actually saw particular political administrations engage heavily in surveillance technologies. Herbert Hoover, for example,
Yep.
heavily surveilled the Black Power movement, as well as Dr. Martin Luther King, for that matter, when it came to the civil rights protests of the 60s and whether or not we were going to see the passage of the Civil Rights Act. It was interesting. Herbert Hoover, who at the time was the director of the FBI, was, under the administration of people like, Lyndon B. Johnson and others who really wanted to do something about civil rights, but yet he was watching the every move of Black activists to ensure that they were not acting as quote unquote communists. And he was watching people who were acting as communists, who were probably really communists at the time, right? And keeping those type of tracks on where they were going, their mobility, their, phone calls. I mean, at that time, the history of it was more about wiretapping, right? Which some of us can't even imagine what
Yeah.
that looks like with the internet, because, if you keep your Alexa on long enough, that she's going to find out what you're talking about. But, that has a historical legacy there. Then you fast forward into the future, that surveillance has come as we've seen technological tools grow. I mean, it begins really with the Internet of Things, when we started placing sensors into our cars to help us with navigation. It started when we were actually going online with Google and actually looking up certain websites. Now, people don't realize that all of those cookies and IP addresses actually are trackable. And that surveillance is what I call like sort of our permissive surveillance, because that is the trade-off that we make when we use those tools. And now today we see surveillance even more prominent, right? Because it's not just the entity of the state that is surveilling, whether it's through drone surveillance, so drones that fly around, much like helicopters, to see what's actually happening with crime, or it's heat maps that we'll talk about later that allow police to sort of have thermal imaging of particular activities that may happen on street corners. We ourselves as citizens surveil. I went out and bought myself a Ring camera, and that Ring camera tells me who comes to my door, if a dog is missing, if a fox shows up at night. And that is my form of citizenship, civilian-led surveillance, particularly as we see more applications like Nextdoor and others really become those entities that report activities back to the police or become the gatekeeper for a community. If somebody strange comes up to your door, potentially deliver a package, and you've never seen them before. So I share all that, Les, is I think that this is something, particularly for communities of color, that's not new. We're used to being surveilled. But I think it's one of those things that with the advent of technology that we've actually seen much more emboldened power of people to actually engage in this as civilians than we have ever seen before. And that's where I think we have to be very conscious of how we look at surveillance tools that are used by the state versus those that are used by citizens. And we also have to start thinking about, these conversations of ethics, fairness, trade-offs, right? And who actually makes a determination on whether or not somebody's supposed to be in your neighborhood at your door, versus, who makes a determination on whether or not, Black Lives Matter activists should be surveilled over the people who took over the Capitol. And so I'll stop there, but, it clearly has a long history of agency that is worth talking about.
Yeah, and I think that actually you're bringing up an interesting point for me, and so if you could clarify a little bit. So I think the way that I often think about this is the surveillance technologies that are used by state, local governments is usually used for, this is a very simple way and it's much more complicated, I'm sure, but they're usually used as a means of controlling people for various reasons, both legitimate and illegitimate, probably. But you brought up this idea of surveillance being used by just average folks as well, the way that we're surveilling ourselves, the members of the public are surveilling ourselves. And I tend to think about that as surveillance, counter surveillance as a kind of resistance. So the idea of when a public authority, such as a police officer, may be violating the law himself or herself, we have members of the public who are now able to document that fact. And you can think about that as a kind of resistance. But it sounds to me that you're saying it's actually more complicated than that sometimes it's members of the public surveilling other members of the public in a way that's really about trying to control as well. Is that kind of something that you have?
No, look, I think you're right on. I think that, citizens have always had counter surveillance, abilities and tactics. The Black Panther Party, when they knew that Hoover was actually surveilling them, they did things differently, right? People don't even know this. Black Lives Matter, when they were taken to the streets after the George Floyd murder, had like a secret code on social media to make sure that they could actually sort of covet what they were actually doing by telling people to leave their cell phones at home so you couldn't be surveilled by location, or wearing the same color, or keeping backpacks stored in your cars. Part of it is the counter surveillance that we're talking about, which is related to technology, which is what I focus on, is that it's not pure. It's actually guided and misguided by the actions of individuals who have values, norms, and assumptions about the world. So if you live in a neighborhood, for example, where everyone has some type of surveillance technology that they've attached now, and this is very different. When I was growing up, we didn't have cameras like that. We had a doorbell, and maybe a little sliding thing that you could see outside your door. Now you have these technologies that are linked to your telephone, can show you images in your house through another, television. And, I'm an active user, for example, of Nextdoor, but I can tell you this, they've had several complaints over the years in terms of the discrimination that may come from people who are doing that counter surveillance. They see somebody who's not familiar in their neighborhood, it's automatically reported. And they have increased their community standards to be able to tell people that there's some inappropriate ways that you actually report, who just opened your door. I was a sociologist like yourself. I go on because I'm always looking for somebody who could build a fence or, help me with a problem at the house, But at the same token, I watch it as a sociologist because it's always very interesting the way people describe the folks that they've caught on camera or the way they post the video. And it's also interesting to see, to your point, the resistance of some of the members of those online communities that actually point out the discrimination that may show up in a post. And I share that because, I consider it to be surveillance in its purest form, because now what we know with those technologies that people can report it to the police. So they're no longer like, hey, every block club is going to sort of put down the lay of the land for their community, but now you can actually, send it over to police and have it be prosecuted. So going forward, Les, to your point, I think that there are structured surveillance technologies, just for the sake of the people listening, that do come from the state, right? There are, things, I taught this actually in my class, right? There's the extension of, scraping of mobile phone data or emails. There's the facial recognition that allows you to do some face detection based on images that may be collected from public cameras or private cameras that are stationed near a crime scene. There are, like I said, drone surveillance, where instead of helicopters, drones are set up to sort of survey the potential area for a defendant or criminal. There's thermal heat maps that allow us to see the density of where crime is committed based on tagging police presence. There's also predictive police analytics that uses data, crime data, to determine whether or not another crime will be committed and at what time of the day. Those types of tools can embolden police officers and other public safety officials to do their job well, but they run the risk of discrimination, particularly when the surveillance is overdone in communities that have typically been seen on the margins. And that's where I think this conversation becomes important from the state part of it, because even though you want that information, because you want to identify, who, this is something we talked about in my class, actually, who actually committed the crime on the corner of 7th and, 8th Avenue or 8th Avenue, you also want to make sure that you're being sensitive to the fact that you're going to find the same person, because guess what? The community itself is segregated and economically impoverished. Same people that live there look like me. So it's a higher likelihood that it's going to be something that you have to really cipher through the trade-offs. Yeah. But at the same token, people do the same thing. And so we're not divorced from the technology, in other words, from who we are. And we have to keep putting that into our mind, that the technology is trained by us, it's used by us, and it's contextualized in spaces that we as humans have also created.
Right. We tend to think about cameras as giving us just objective pictures. And in fact, there's a whole process of understanding and interpretation. It's kind of working in many cases behind the scenes, or where we even choose to place a camera.
That's right. That's right. I mean, I can tell you, when I was in graduate school at Northwestern, at that time, they were actually implementing the traffic control programs, like huge. I went into this data center. This is a true story. And it was like, all the screens that I want in my house, like, were on this big wall, essentially allowing them to see every street corner in Chicago. But it was really interesting. Those blue light cameras were primarily directed in Black and brown communities. Yeah. And so that was almost 15 years ago. Imagine the precision of the technology today, and so part of it is, again, what was purpose for traffic control is now purpose towards criminal, activity, and they tend to be overrepresented in marginalized communities.
Yeah. So, one of the things that I just want to kind of underscore and draw attention to, because I think it is a real multiplier in terms of the consequences, good or bad, that surveillance has. And that is, it seems to me that something important happened. We began by saying there's always been surveillance. But in the past, there was always the problem of, well, what do we do with all this information that we're gathering, scraping with our surveillance technologies? And it was always kind of, there had to be on the other end a human analyst or many human analysts. And now it seems to me that what may be new in a qualitative sense and quantitative sense, I suppose, is artificial intelligence and the ability to take, caches of data that no human analyst could ever analyze in their lifetime, and actually come up with results that are actionable by various agencies and organizations. And so I'm curious to hear how much of a game changer that has been, and where that nexus or that connection between the surveillance and the AI on the other end, where is it happening, I think, in its most consequential forms?
So that is like a really good question. And it's actually, I think we talked about this on the last panel we did. Yeah. I like hanging out with Les. We talk about these really important issues. So, keep these at the dinner table kind of conversations. So listen, when we talk about artificial intelligence, we should be scared, right? Part of it is that we want this human cognition in ways that we as humans are not efficient. Our brains don't operate that way. I mean, I know I woke up today tired for some reason, and like my brain is like 2 seconds behind me. And robots don't think like that, right? Because they basically are built off of the best in terms of the human engineering of our minds and the repetitiveness of our language, our actions and activities that actually feed into these systems. With that being the case, I argue in my research that robots don't just show up and are all of a sudden less biased. The people who actually create them come with their own set of value norms and assumptions, just like we talked about with surveillance capital, and they actually apply that to the actual machine itself. So when we think about machine learning algorithms, which tend to be based on repetitive action, sort of like it scrapes the best of the best in terms of predictions, and it pulls these attributes from the internet to sort of make this composite profile of why this prediction is the case. I'll give you a perfect example. It doesn't work well when it comes to criminal justice. I mean, judges use criminal justice algorithms to help them to alleviate the burden of paperwork and overtax criminal justice systems. But yet, those systems that they rely upon, again, are built into contexts where criminal justice is not fair or fairly executed among a variety of people. So, what happens? A criminal justice algorithm has a tendency to incarcerate or detain Black men or women more than it does white men or women. And that's largely because, as a sociologist, we've been taught that more crimes may happen equally between white and Black communities, but more surveillance and arrest happens in communities of color. So they tend to show up more. And so I think it's really important that people understand that distinction, and it doesn't absolve judges from going back and saying, what trade-off am I making by following a model that is essentially doing the same thing I could have done from the bench? And where are there other factors that I might want to take in consideration in addition to the model that would actually be much more fair and inclusive in the long run? And I think, when we start looking at AI, when we look at surveillance, the same thing happens. Those tools that I talked about that may be, external drones and heat maps, they're trained as well by certain data that starts out skewed. And as a result of that, they're trained to detect certain behaviors, which again are placed within the context of communities where those behaviors may be more prevalent simply because people have historically been sort of laid out into red line communities where there's lack of opportunity and where crime is an option, for a variety of reasons. And so part of it is, trying to get artificial intelligence to be designed in a way that's more conscionable, but also in a way that includes more voices and seats at the table, that includes more social scientists along with engineers, and that allows us to see the fallibility of these models. And I think that's, the thing that scares me the most is that, we have this issue in terms of the development of the technology, and particularly in areas like surveillance for criminal justice, or policing, that needs another round of scrutiny, to make sure that we're not actually bringing in more biases, even though there's some engineers who argue me down and say, well, the technology is more objective, because you're not actually looking at a person based on race. Yeah, tell that to the loan officer who uses an algorithm to make a determination and still doesn't give you credit when you walk in the door to sign your papers, right? But the other thing too, I would just say this less too in terms of technology and surveillance capital, is that at the end of the day, these computers should not be trained to make their own decisions, right? And so someone has to come in and sort of do some interpretability, or these systems have to be interpretable. And I think that's where, again, AI can become really tricky because, again, it can reduce the workload and be more proficient, but at the same time, it can embolden certain inequalities that we've really tried to get away from. And civil rights violations, Facial recognition people don't understand this, right? We look at the January 6th insurrection and we're like, why is it taking so long to find these people? They're using a combination of facial rec, they're using social media surveillance, in terms of finding the pictures that people posted. They're using contextual text surveillance. There's a lot of stuff to get to those folks, right? But just 3 months prior to that, we used facial recognition in Detroit, a police department, and pulled over an African-American guy and held him for 6 hours, and he wasn't even the person in the video. And so we've got to think about the way these technologies are built and designed and tested, but also how they're all applied and whether or not they're applied fairly.
Yeah, I actually just by happenstance caught a seminar or a discussion with some military professionals about the use of AI in drones to make decisions about human targets in warfare. And they were talking seriously about that we are on the cusp of having the technology to be able to kind of do that in what they believed was effective. And of course, that's very controversial, and I think it should be controversial. I think it absolutely needs to be, at a minimum, just thought very hard about before we.
I know, right? I would want to use that on military. I'd be like, oh my God, that drone is coming towards me. I mean, facial recognition already can't recognize darker skin complexions, right? And there are challenges with face detection. I change my hair all the time. I think last week I was talking to you, I was in braids. They can't recognize me when I change my hair.
Right.
And so, we start to militarize these technologies or use them as weapons of mass destruction. We should also be careful. I haven't gotten to that part yet in terms of the military, but honestly, the military does a lot of great R&D, but I still think that there's sort of like this understanding that, again, with policing departments and law enforcement, was something that we talked about in the class. But sometimes you got to use those cameras that are sitting in front of restaurants and stores because they're the best way for us to identify a person who may have committed a crime right on that street corner. And listen, I totally agree. I want bad people off the street. But I think when that data gets back into the district, it needs to be scrutinized to ensure that you have gone through a variety of scenarios before you bring in a young kid that may not be the person in the video. And I think that's where the shiny object debate gets really muddled.
And to your point, I think just to kind of boil down what you said, because you're putting a lot of information out there, and it's all great. But to boil down what I kind of want to.
Are you trying to say it's too early for all this information?
No, you're doing great. To kind of boil down on that, I think we need to involve ethicists, social scientists, and ethicists in the room to have these discussions. And what happens too often, or what I'm hearing happen too often, in my more amateurish sort of take on this development of surveillance technology, is that there is a sense that all we have to do is improve the clarity of the camera, because the only problem is going to be if the human that sees that image, if a human ever sees that image, it can see it clearly. But because the camera somehow is giving us an objective look at reality, and that's just not the case.
No, I mean, that's the thing, it's so funny because, there's NIST, there are several government agencies, without getting too deep, that are actually dealing with these technical cadence issues. And, camera matters, poor quality images. I got about 7 ring lights around me right now just to make sure my lighting is okay. I mean, those things matter in terms of the clarity of the photo and the picture. Again, the key determination is, one, again, and I want to go back to my original point, we have mugshot data that is overrepresentative of Black men and women and brown men and women. So that's part of the challenge, that more likely your face will be in there for whatever reason, because you may have had some disproportionate access to the criminal justice system, because that is the nature of discriminatory criminal justice systems and the nature of our historical legacy here in the country. But the same token, the technology is not perfected, or the technical cadence is off. There was a study that basically said that members of the Congressional Black Caucus, when run through a proprietary facial recognition software, came back as criminals. These are legislators that were misidentified as like open, active criminals and with mugshots. And so something has to be done about that. A lot of people are talking about banning it, which I suggest that, I want you to ban it, but honestly, I want you to perfect it, because I want to use it too. And so that's what we have to think about, ways that we bring the right mix of interdisciplinary perspective to these conversations, particularly when they matter the most. Look, when the Boston Marathon bomber was identified many years ago, there was a surveillance camera that had a great image of that person right at the marathon, and it resulted in his immediate arrest, point blank.
Yeah.
We have to be able to say, and that's why I tell people technology is like two sides of the coin. Yeah, that's the one. We see him bracing for it. It's I hate to go even deeper. It's almost like some of the AI technologies now that not only look at the image, but they're seeing if you smile. They're seeing if you tilt your head a certain way. They're seeing it's not just your face, but how you act. It's called emotional intelligence AI that also determines whether or not you are the likely criminal. And so
Wow.
we have to really get away from some of these suitability metrics that, somebody in a ivory tower is sort of developed for local people, because trust me, it may have a disproportionate impact on people of color and other marginalized populations, but it'll affect everybody else. Where
Yeah.
people will be misidentified simply
Yeah.
because the rate of technology is so much faster than policy making.
And something you've touched on now a couple times is what I would call social sorting. So, we often think about surveillance technologies as catching people in the act, and they're doing, my understanding is that surveillance is doing so much more than that,
Yeah.
especially with AI analyzing images, but also your browser activity and making correlations between different types of activity. Um, that that one of the applications that's come out of that is social sorting. In other words, putting certain people on no-fly lists. That
Hmm.
they had no idea that they were on a no-fly list, nor do they understand why they got put on a no-fly list. But there's other applications too. You can think about how social sorting might, in some cases, affect an employment decision. And I just wonder, I guess if you could say a little bit about that.
Well, you know what, Les, I think this is actually kind of interesting because I know a whole lot of stuff. And then when you threw that question on social sorting, I had to look it up.
Okay. Yeah,
You
but
know, and think about
yeah,
I was gonna offer you the opportunity to write me a blog about it because I thought it was interesting when I actually started doing research on it. I was like, social sorting, I've not heard about this one. Well, look, I think that, to the point of my looking at what social sorting, and it kind of goes back to what we talk about with regards to this mapping of what we think is, the stereotypical targeting of people, by zip code could be a social sorting factor. I didn't think of the
yeah,
no-fly list zone. All of these things that sort of aggregate people's reality just based on what the computer extrapolates or interprets about them, those are dangerous sorters and they have implications, right?
yeah,
There are people who don't realize that they're even on these lists because the opacity of the internet doesn't
yeah,
allow us to see just how deep these inequalities are. I tell people all the time, people like Latanya Sweeney at Harvard University have written really great stuff where, people, by the nature of the sounding of your last name, Rodriguez, Turner, may actually be sorted into categories by race because the black soundingness of your name or the Latina soundingness of your name or the Asian soundingness of your name actually gets people to make correlations about your credit, your housing options, your suitability for employment. And lets you know that this is not new. I mean, back in 19 something something when we was in graduate school, we had to read people who actually talked about proxies like, you know, street address or other things that kept people off the top lists for employers because they kind of knew where you lived.
yep,
This was before the internet where you could actually look up their house.
yeah,
And so part of the challenge in all of this, and this goes back to the work that I do at Brookings as a policymaker, we don't have federal privacy legislation that puts strongholds on what people can collect and what they can't collect. And it doesn't also allow us to give some stipulations on how you make determinations on what you collect. As far as we're concerned, everybody is being surveilled,
yeah,
whether it is surveillance from the physical sense, as we started this conversation, to data surveillance. Your information is readily available because we don't have, like the European Union and other places, any regulatory compliance or legislative guardrails that say, no, you cannot collect this. No, you cannot make assumptions based on a person's name or their zip code or what they actually purchase on the internet that may give you the inference that they may be a person who's in a vulnerable group. And until we sort of do that, that's what I do every day. I sit there and I try to figure this out as a sociologist, mind you. So I encourage anybody to take this on, even if you're not an engineer. But we've got to figure this out because it's going to have long-range consequences.
yeah. And I wonder in thinking about, kind of taking stock of everything that we've talked about thus far in our conversation. What is it? I mean, let me put it this way. People often talk about a trade-off. We need surveillance because it gives us safety. And yeah, you have to give up some of your civil liberties, but do you want to be safe? And it's often framed in that way. Now, that framing seems sometimes to be more appropriate than other times. I was recently thinking, and I sent you in advance my thought on this. I was thinking that a better framing might be that sometimes the reason that surveillance is billed as something we need is because it improves efficiency to just get through lines quicker, efficiency to understand who the criminal is faster. That's what it's kind of billed as, but at what cost? And it seems to me that sometimes the cost is injustice, or taking a different approach, that cost might be the legitimacy of an organization. Like, we're seeing, I think, often a discussion about police becoming less legitimate in the eyes of the public, and that may be related directly to surveillance that police officers and police organizations employ on populations. And I'm wondering if you have a way that you think about that trade-off.
Oh, I mean, of course. I mean, so prior to the pandemic, I spent a lot of time overseas as part of my job. So I do domestic policy work as well as global policy work. And I spent a lot of time in China.
Yeah.
And, one of the things that when you step off the plane in China or before you go, automatically know you're going to be surveilled. The Chinese have maybe 800 in certain parts of China, or Chinese, I think alone, I think the statistic I read a couple years ago was about 800,000 cameras that are deployed throughout their major cities. And they're watching you. I mean, whenever I'm in Beijing or Shanghai or some even small water town, I can actually see that those cameras are watching me. One time I was walking down the street and I heard a big boop. I was like, oh, I looked around and I was by myself and I realized that something was up at the light post. It was following me around, which makes sense. There's not so many Black women that walk around China, late at night. I'll tell you more stories about that. But, you expect that to be the case. Now, it works out for China because first and foremost, they have implicit consent by people. People in China know that they will be surveilled, right? And that surveillance happens not just through physical cameras, but also the way the Chinese government has sort of structured the digital economy. You also walk around with a QR code, and most of the people, like we have Facebook, are really tied to WeChat because it not only does social networks, but it allows you to pay for stuff, get healthcare, and do a whole range of activities that are equated with citizenship. Now, when you look at a place like the United States, how would that go with the United States? And obviously, we are not China, right? We are a country that believes in human rights and civil liberties. We're a country that believes that we have privacy when it comes to our personal spaces. We're a country that feels that we are protective of the things that we own, right? And that's why we want this right to bear arms and we want the right to have our own personal opinions. Those are constitutional mandates that came with building this country. But this country has not been fair. And that's where we have to sort of look at the same type of surveillance capital that happens here in the United States from the standpoint of the protection of assets. In some respects, and not to be deep, it could be the protection of white supremacy for all I know, right? But it's something that is driving our ability to surveil certain populations more than others. And so we have to be careful of that because it's not just a surveillance for surveillance sake. I want people to be really clear. I'm not in no way saying that. It goes with the sociological implications of what people think happens when their neighborhood has too many poor people in it. And so they get more cameras to make sure that their property is, because that's who we are as capitalists, right? We protect our property. It's embedded in the constitutional mandate of this country. And with that comes our ability to want to be able to get the bad people when they do bad things. Now, I think most of us, because of this hardcore value that we have, we realize that the Constitution is good as a guiding practice, but it doesn't always work out pragmatically as times change. And so, as you mentioned, it's very hard for people, for example, in the gun debate, to understand the senseless violence that happens with guns if you've never had anybody shot. And so until we start to see this sort of conflict that we have as individuals, as citizens, between the fact that we want the cameras out there because we know it's going to catch the bad actors. In some cases, the Ring camera will pick up the bad fox that's been in your or the bad deer that is actually eating in your vegetable garden, right? But for the most part, we also want to make sure that we're not the object of that surveillance too. And so that's where, like, I work on stuff as a policymaker, and I do this in my own class here with the program to get people to always see that history is always interpretable. And as a sociologist, based on the questions that you actually put on the table, you can also get different answers. The key thing for me is if you get more people who are sensitized to this, engineers who are building this model that understand the sociological, socio-technical implications of what they build. If you get more sociologists to understand that technology is fallible and that it's up to us as social scientists to help people understand the framework in which they're deployed, I think you make a better technology that actually allows us to answer the questions that you're talking about, Les, which is, in which cases should I be more afraid of this technology? And in which cases do I want to be more educated? We're doing a project right now, and I'm doing with Dr. Ray, who's your partner in crime in this program here,
Yep.
that says that, listen, you can't give law enforcement shiny objects of facial recognition without training.
Yeah.
Because the only thing they're going to do is use it to embolden the stuff that they're already doing. So
Right.
how do you make sure they're trained? How do you make sure there's some guardrails? And how do you make sure the citizens are on the right side of its use, even if it means it's for the bad actors? There's something there versus
Right.
just using it just because.
Excellent. So kind of moving to something else that you've already alluded to in previous comments. I'm very aware that there's a seismic shift, I think, happening in the way that we're using surveillance and the data collected from surveillance. And that is that, and I think most people frankly have this idea that surveillance is still used in this way, which is that a crime has occurred, or maybe you want to track the movements of a person who's gone missing. And so what you do is you go and in this example, you talk to store owners or people who have cameras up, and you look at kind of where they moved, or where they went to, and try to track them down or get a good picture of them. And in that example, what you're really doing is you're using a surveillance technology as a way to solve a past crime or understand something that's happened in the past.
Yes.
But the shift has been, as you know, to predictive applications, to thinking about Minority Report, that Tom Cruise movie.
Yes.
Right?
That's Dr. Ray's favorite movie.
Hey,
The Minority Report.
It's a good movie. The only thing I had a hard time with was the way that they did it was they had to have people laying down in pools.
Yeah.
I don't know, use some bizarre.
You're dating yourself here. For those of you watching, go to Netflix and look up Minority Report.
Yeah, that's a good point. I forget. So, so my point is that the move is to take all of this data and really run it into a black box, like these machine learning algorithms that are working in ways that we don't always completely understand, but they're producing some kind of a prediction or a risk assessment that can be used as a prediction. And I think, like a lot of my questions, I don't have a specific question about this. It's just the idea that I find to be terrifying. And I'm wondering if maybe you can talk a little bit about that, and maybe even enlighten us as to some of the applications that we should be aware of.
Well, no, I completely agree. I mean, this is my own opinion as a researcher, that anything that is actually collected to give a cumulative understanding of what happened in a crime, I think is probably feasible. I'm a huge fan of, you're watching the Minority Report, and when I'm up at night, can't get to sleep, I watch the first 48, which is all about tracking down and gathering the investigative intelligence that will help people get to the actual killer. Or, because unfortunately, the criminal justice system is designed for us to prosecute. It's not designed for us to gather data. It's actually designed to have compelling enough data that you could actually convict somebody.
Right.
With that being the case, I think, prior to the advent of these technologies, there were always technologies that were used for that purpose. Once you had a inclination that this person might have been the person you're looking for. What do we see? Wiretapping, submission of a passive witness to help in the wiretapping, sensors to develop location trackers. And what's so interesting, Les, about your question is many of these things that we see in new technology, just simple things like location data, were not designed for police to pick it up. Right. And that's part of the quagmire, right? Like our Google searches, even if we decide one day we're actually researching how to kill, my family with bleach, was not necessarily designed for the law enforcement to go in and grab that content to have it surveilled to determine whether or not you were the person that actually killed your family with bleach. The question is that, there's two things that come up with me on this all the time. And I'm hoping that, the people who are listening are sort of like me. First and foremost, everybody knows that we're surveilled. Yeah. I find it so interesting that we still have people who in broad daylight will do certain things without any understanding that there are probably cameras in that bodega. There are probably cameras down the street in terms of a Ring camera. And there's probably somebody who is watching you in some way by taking a photo of you with their phone. So that goes back to the fact that we live in a highly enriched and robust surveillance economy, period.
Yep.
And the extent to which you do something wrong, you're going to be caught, right? The
Right.
question becomes, like you said, like how do you continue to balance these technologies in a space where it can be equitable and fair? And it's like, you just can't unless when you are using the technologies to sort of scout out what you believe are your reasonable predictions about a crime. I'm gonna be honest, the way that you do this is we as policymakers have to put in place legal guardrails so that we protect citizens. What does that mean? Maybe we have privacy protections that say that criminal law enforcement cannot collect this type of data. We're seeing it on the self-regulatory side, where companies like Apple are like, no, you're not going into the back door to find out who was the last call they had, even though law enforcement just gets some great hacker to do the same thing, right? We see that in several cases. The key thing is we have to come up with a framework for what's permissible. And the unfortunate thing is that consumers are going to continue to be the victim of this, just simply because we as legislators have sort of misunderstood this. And we've done exactly what you said, which is to hold on to the social responsibilities of our safety. Go back to our constitutional mandate that we are protecting our privacy and protecting our property. But at the same token, we've not had legislators understand how these new technologies have become much more invasive and how they can be workarounds of these same civil liberties that we've protected so long. And so, I just find, the cybersecurity space, I don't really get into less a lot, but I think it's going to be one of the next areas that is actually going to come with what we're talking about, particularly when we start to look at not just the global influence overseas, but the global infiltration here in the United States, and how that actually looks when it comes to our data infrastructure.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm mindful of the time. We have about 8 minutes left. And
I know, I didn't think we were going to get this deep, man.
Oh, this has been a great conversation. I've got at least one question I'm dying to get out, but I'm gonna. Oh, my camera got blurry there.
Yeah, you got all are you being surveilled because you got a little muddy there? You got all distorted and stuff.
Maybe. So one of the questions is, Dr. Turner-Lee, what are your thoughts on the Ring cameras being accessed by the police department? Do you see this being a mandate in the future to use these types of devices to gather data by police, government on everyone without necessarily getting permission? It's a great question.
Oh, it's a fantastic question. So, I think we're actually going to see, Maria, more of this. I mean, obviously, there are some relationships and agreements between Amazon, who's the maker of the Ring camera, and, law enforcement. And there are some cases where they have actually signed these agreements, from my understanding, where it is a permissible reciprocation of data, where, and we also see civilians who are voluntarily giving up that data too, right? Not uncommon that we're seeing a society where people are basically saying, hey, I caught this on my Ring. Look at my footage, right? And so that is as we talked about earlier, which is what we thought would be counter surveillance, which has actually been civilians sort of feeding into extra surveillance. With that being the case, I do think that we're going to see some policy implications going forward on what does that look like. As more of this data is available by individuals, and I actually know for a fact that there's been some recent articles in the newspaper of improvements to also let civilians go through a checklist before you think a criminal is at your door, right? I found it so interesting. Like I said, I'm one of those people, I'm so wonky, right? Where I look at some of the things, oh, somebody was at my door. And then somebody's like, oh, it was a package that was delivered, right? Because the Ring camera only gets the face up. It doesn't necessarily show the guy holding your package, and I think until we actually have more experience with what these new consumer-enabled tools are, it's going to be hard to make them justifiable in a court of law. And so, Maria, to your question, I think the end goal is not only can it go to law enforcement, but will it be permissible? And I'm waiting for the constitutional fight that will say, someone catching me on their Ring camera walking down the street is not necessarily is an intrusion of my personal right to walk down the street, versus making it something where, that person could have been the criminal walking down the street, but hiding behind their First Amendment rights. So it'll be interesting going forward, but I love the question. Keep scouting this because I think it's going to be a topic of interest.
Mark is actually kind of getting close to a question that I want to ask you. And Mark asks, how do we involve the public in policy making decisions about how technology is used? It's sort of, I think the spirit of that question is what next? How do we make sure we steer this in the right direction?
You know, you've got to get civilians at the table, Mark. So I'm working on a model right now. It's called an Energy Star rating when it comes to algorithmic bias that really points at some of the things I've talked about today. One is the technical cadence. So what goes into technology design that's inclusive, ethical, fair? The public policies, like, you know, people don't understand this, that civil rights laws don't even apply explicitly to technology in many cases. That's why we see a lot of these permissionless forgiveness opportunities. Like, oh, I'm so sorry you didn't see all the ads for housing that you were supposed to see, you know. And so we've got to make sure that we have some civil rights guidance around that. I think in the long run, we need sort of my third part of my model is a feedback loop. So civilians can come in and let companies know and let government know when there's an AI system that is going awry or is creating disparate impact. And so I think going forward, the public, first and foremost, Mark, has to understand that these systems even exist, right? Because we tend to be very static. Oh, we got our Ring camera installed, and we don't really think of it as I'm getting my Ring camera so I can catch criminals. We actually really start out pretty innocuous. I'm getting it so I know who's at my door. But, you know, we've got to let the public know how these algorithmic and AI systems are more baked and entrenched in our society in ways that we've not picked up. And in the absence of any type of literacy around this, it's just going to continue to go. I mean, people don't understand that. That's why I do what I do, because people just don't understand the depth of how technology is created and how it's shared and what the public impact is. So I'm hoping, Mark, going forward that we'll actually see more public commissions, and cities and states will actually say, when we start to see law enforcement involved with facial recognition and other systems, they'll bring people together for a community hearing to talk about that. We're seeing that in Maryland. They just did something, for example, to ban facial recognition for businesses. But, you know, going forward, I think we'll have more conversation, more citizen engagement. Participatory models are what works and what makes this better versus having people design it in a lab.
And I think even if there is a little bit of inefficiency in, say, a community coming together to help to, you know, together govern exactly how surveillance is used in the public, even if that decision process in itself is a little bit inefficient, the one of the points that I had brought up earlier is I think that surveillance is always brushing up against this question of legitimacy. You know, like you can't just push forward because something's a good technology, even if the public is thinking that it's Big Brother, irrespective of whether it's a good technology or not, there's going to be some very, you know, bad implications about.
Well, you know, but look, that's the problem. I have sat on a lot of panels like you where I look at some of these technologies and I tell you, I just, my skin just crawls because in my mind I'm thinking, well, I mean, I thought the TSA was bad, right? When you go through the TSA and they could run that scan of your body without you knowing, you know, what they're saying.
Right.
But the type of surveillance technologies that we're seeing today that are basically emboldened by artificial intelligence and being put in the hands of actors who are in the business of catching problems, that's where I think we have to change the model where it's not deficit based, but it's actually asset based.
Yeah.
And as Mark said, you know, the more people we have at the table sort of giving, you know, suggestions, helping us to audit, giving us real feedback on this, and the more data we collect on outcomes, the better it will be. I mean, listen, I love how you started this. The fact that people pulled out their cameras when George Floyd was going through his deal, when Philando Castillo was going through his deal, Walter Scott was going through his deal, and they were able to actually have in the George Floyd case the admissibility of that cell phone footage to piece together a conviction of what I think America saw was really just a heinous crime. That's different. And that surveillance, though, also may have to be balanced in the future with safety of individuals who may be in the crossfire of these things. And I'm sensitive to that. I hate to sort of end that way, but that's where the work that I do is where the surveillance capital has two sides of a coin. There are opportunities and then there are perils. And we just have to decide who sits at the table to help us understand both.
I think that's a fantastic way to kind of tie this conversation up. I hope you'll permit me to just take 30 more seconds and say, I can't help myself. It's a problem. My family hates
Well,
it.
you're back. So whoever was surveilling you, you're clearer now. Okay.
Yeah, I see that. I see that. 30 more seconds to just put in something that in kind of researching for this discussion with you, Nicole. I came across a sociologist at NYU, Harvey Molotov, I want to say is his name.
They do some real cool stuff there, yeah.
Yeah, and one of the points that he made, which I had totally taken for granted, but it's just worth mentioning, and I think it really speaks to a vision for the future of surveillance and how we can think about it. People tend to think about surveillance strictly as a way of controlling other people.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly that is something to worry about. And we've even seen applications of surveillance where that seems to be the objective. But if you think about going to an airport, for example, where you're going through a security check, everybody is getting surveilled in that sense. What he was saying is like, we need to open up our imagination about how, like what the role is of people and the technologies that we deploy
Mm-hmm.
in how they interact with people. And it doesn't have to be this kind of cold sort of interaction where somebody stands behind a wall or a desk and points a camera at you and is looking for you to show some evidence that you're one of the bad people who has ill intentions. What it could also be is actually some of these people who are employed to check your bags in the airport case, they could maybe also be helping people with their stroller, getting people through the line in a more efficient, friendly way, because it turns out that kind of human interaction with people is not just good for what we expect of public servants to do, but it's also good in terms of gaining information about what people are doing, but contextualized information, because when you help somebody with a stroller, you're also talking to them about their travel plans. Mm-hmm. And that can be far more useful than an X-ray scanner that it penetrates every single layer of what they've packed in their bags. And so I found that to be kind of interesting.
No, look, it's interesting. I wish I could talk to a TSA. I mean, I always get to the airport late and I'm always like complaining because the TSA line and DCA just got longer. I can't tell you how happy I've been not to travel. I'm going on vacation a couple of weeks, so I'm bracing myself, but it's been nice not to travel. But listen, you are a sociologist, my friend, and there's something that I'm saying this now on video that Les Andrist is going to publish something with me on this. I'm just letting you all know. But listen, this is the deal, and we'll wrap up here. Robert Putnam, back in the early parts of his career, wrote about bowling alone. It's something I write about in my book that's coming out this fall from Brookings Press. And Bowling Alone was all about the breakup of the collective activism and relationships that people had, and the fact that people are sort of finding themselves in this rugged individualism, right? Where they're doing stuff by themselves. And it's really clear. I mean, look around you. People want a mask, they don't want a mask. They want to send their kids to school, they don't want to send them to school. And we're seeing this play out before our eyes as, citizens who are making our own choices when it comes to agency. TSA doesn't have to x-ray you and not say hello, but they choose not to do that because that's the way society has been structured. The challenge today, though, with technology is that it just allows us to go deeper into those bubbles.
Yeah.
And so I always share with people when I think about algorithmic discrimination, for example, or algorithmic bias, I think about it like this. When I was a little kid, I used to go on the playground in my elementary school because we did go outside at that time. And there were monkey bars and slides and swings and a sandbox and all these other things you could play on. And as a little kid, because we didn't have technology, we were able to go from the sandbox to the swings to the slide to, the monkey bars, and just do that until the bell rang and the recess was over. In the algorithmic economy, what we do is we stay on our slides. We stay in our swings. We find ourselves, being more empathetic towards issues that are people in the sandbox or on the monkey bars. And why is that? Because the algorithm is designed to reaffirm our interests and buy-in to our affinity groups, our likes, our interests. That's why when we click those things, we just see more of it. Just look at your feed and you'll see people just like yourself. And so at some point, we have to break that logjam. And what we're talking about in terms of this data surveillance of this topic is we either like it or we don't. And if we want to find a middle, as it was suggested in that article, the middle is that people have to have agency over these things. And they have to realize that bowling alone is always not fun because you have nobody to compete with, right? And nobody to share your chicken wings or your soda. And if we realize that society has some benefits with us leveraging technology for those good opportunities, while at the same time understanding the times that we need to come outdoors. I mean, look at what people are doing now. You put 14 months of people inside and tell them they can't go outside, they're going to go outside because they're realizing the things that they lost. And so, this is one of those conversations I think we can come back. But another shameless plug, if you're part of this program, I do teach this in the Applied Research and Technological Training class that we just finished. And I'll be teaching in the fall. But the key thing is continue to have these conversations because they really do matter.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. We're gonna end it there, as is now common to hear news anchors from every major station say when they have to end an interview. We are past time, and
well, I was late, so you got a full hour. So thank you, Parker, for being for sticking around.
Oh, yeah,
the extra 4 minutes, right? Exactly.
Thank you. You're right. It is your fault. Thank you. No, it's always a treasure to have you here, and I appreciate your expertise and just the smiles that you always bring to the webinars that you grace us with. And so thank you very much. For everybody who came late, I am the program director, Lester Andrist, of the Public Safety Leadership and Administration Professional Master's Program here on campus. If you or anyone you know who's in public safety wants to advance their careers, please check us out. It will be worth your while. We have more people like Dr. Nicol Turner-Lee involved in the program. All right, take care, everybody. Thank you so much for your questions, and I look forward to seeing you sometime in the future. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.